This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Gregg, can you describe your last 24, 48 hours?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster.
Gregg Carlstrom is the Middle East correspondent over at The Economist. And for the last few days, he has been monitoring what Israeli and American officials have called the last real chance for a ceasefire in Gaza. On Saturday, there was a lot of optimism about a deal. And by Sunday, that optimism had curdled. Both sides walked away.
And then, rather unexpectedly, on Monday night, came a statement from Hamas saying that, in fact, they had agreed to a ceasefire deal with Israel, and then Israel said it was reviewing what Hamas had agreed to. So it has been a bit bewildering.
How surprising was it to you that Hamas said they had accepted the terms of the negotiation?
It was very surprising. I mean, first, I don't think anyone was expecting the Hamas leadership in Gaza, the real decision makers in the movement, to accept the agreement because they have rejected just about everything that has been on the table.
It seems like we still don't know whether Israel agrees that this agreement is real. I know you described this process as a roller coaster. Like, how will we know the roller coaster has stopped?
I think it's going to be several days before we know both the details of what's in it and then how Israel is going to respond to it.
Many in Rafah didn't wait to celebrate. They took to the streets, they honked car horns. Even though just hours before this tentative agreement was floated, Israel rained down leaflets on one neighborhood, warning residents to get out if they wanted to live. It's worth noting, as Israel considers a ceasefire, its invasion of Rafah will continue.
In fact, the War Cabinet said that it unanimously agreed to continue the offensive in Rafah. It may not turn into tens of thousands of troops moving into the city, but I don't think they have any intention of stopping hostilities until such time as there is actually a deal agreed to by both sides.
You do not sound optimistic.
No, I'm not. I mean, I think what we've seen for months now is this cycle where everyone says we're getting close. And we've worked out the number of hostages that'll be released and the number of Palestinian prisoners that'll be freed and the duration of the ceasefire. But there's always been this sticking point of Hamas wants this to be a permanent ceasefire. They want this to end the war. And Israel, certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing allies in the government, they only want this to be a temporary truce. There's no way to reconcile those two positions. They are fundamentally incompatible with each other, and mediators have tried to fudge it. They've tried to come up with language about, we'll start with a temporary truce, but then we'll have talks about making it permanent. They've tried to find workarounds like that, but they have not found a way to bridge these two very, very irreconcilable positions.
Today on the show, have negotiators found a way to reconcile the irreconcilable? Or are negotiations about to break down again? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is brought to you by Discover. When it comes to your finances, Discover wants you to know they are the credit card that is always there for you. With 24/7 U.S.-based live customer service, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We are talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. I'm wondering if you can just slow walk me through the TikTok of talks breaking down. Like, I know that everyone agrees basically things began to break down on Sunday. So how would you describe what happened and in what order?
On Saturday, everyone was waiting for the Hamas leadership in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, the group's leader in Gaza, to give a response to the Egyptian ceasefire proposal. And then on Saturday and Sunday, there were several comments from Israeli officials. First, from an unnamed diplomatic official who turned out to be Prime Minister Netanyahu, but speaking anonymously to Israeli media, who said that even if there is a ceasefire agreement, the Rafah offensive is still going forward. Netanyahu then later in the weekend, on camera in public, said something very similar. Once Netanyahu made these comments, Hamas seemed to back off. And by Monday, the messaging from everyone, from Israelis, from Hamas, from American officials, Arab officials, the messaging from everyone was that Netanyahu had sabotaged the talks with his comments and that there was no way Hamas was going to respond positively to the deal.
Why would Netanyahu want to scuttle his own deal? Like, why would he be going out saying things that he knew or should know would make Hamas angry and make a deal less attainable?
He's always been uncertain about whether or not he actually wants to make that deal. And he's been uncertain because he is caught between, on the one hand, members of his war cabinet and a sizable chunk of the Israeli public who want to make a hostage deal, who think that even if it means postponing perhaps indefinitely the operation in Rafah, perhaps ending the war, that Israel has an obligation to do what it can to return the 130 or so hostages who are still being held in Gaza. That's a position that does have a fair amount of support, again, both within the war cabinet and amongst the public at large. But on the other hand, Netanyahu is also very concerned about his right-wing coalition partners, and they have been very, very clear that if he approves a ceasefire deal that might lead to an end to the war, that they're going to leave the coalition. And for Netanyahu, he's concerned, as he has been for 7 months now, that if his right-wing coalition partners leave, that means there's going to be an early election. More likely than not, he is going to lose that early election. And so he is desperate to do whatever he can to keep those members of his coalition on side. And until now, he hasn't really had to make a choice because Hamas has rejected many of the ceasefire offers that were on the table. But if there is a serious proposal now, he will have to make a choice that he's been trying to avoid for many, many months about whether to do that deal, perhaps ending the war in the process, or whether to continue with the war.
Yeah, I saw it as kind of calling Israel's bluff because Israel has been painting Hamas as recalcitrant, being unreasonable in all of these negotiations. And to sort of return and say, well, we accept the terms really does mean that if Israel accepts the terms, you have a ceasefire. If Israel rejects the terms, Hamas can say, actually, Israel's being unreasonable here.
I think that's exactly right. It's a very canny diplomatic ploy on their part, where Netanyahu was expecting Hamas to reject the deal, in which case he could present them as being the obstacle to a ceasefire. By turning around and accepting something, whatever it is they've accepted, Hamas has put the ball back in Israel's court. And if Netanyahu rejects this, then they can portray him as the one who is an obstacle to bringing about a ceasefire. It could end up being in some ways a win-win for Hamas, where if Israel agrees to a ceasefire now, it would buy perhaps months of calm in Gaza, and Hamas could gamble that if it gets months of calm, it might be very hard for Israel after stopping the war for several months to go back and resume the war over huge international objections. So it could work out for them if Israel agrees to it. And if Israel doesn't agree to it and goes ahead and accelerates its offensive in Rafah, then that's going to do real damage to Israel's relationship with the United States, its relationship with other countries. And that is not necessarily a bad thing from Hamas's perspective either, causing even more of a rupture between Israel and its closest allies.
So we're talking the afternoon of Monday, May 6th, Eastern Time here in the U.S. We do not know really what exactly Israel is going to make of this. Like, Israel has said, we're going to send people to talk about this, but we're going to continue to move forward on the war. Can you just think through what Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet are weighing at this hour?
I think the first thing that they're weighing is whether this deal in substance is close enough to what they've already agreed that they can accept it. There's been some reporting, for example, that in the original Egyptian proposal, it was meant to take place over 3 phases, and any talk of a permanent ceasefire wouldn't happen until the 3rd phase. There are reports that in what Hamas has agreed to now, there would be talk of a permanent ceasefire in the 2nd phase. And that may not be something that Israel is willing to agree to because, again, Netanyahu and his allies, they don't want to talk at all about a permanent ceasefire. So that's going to be the first thing they weigh. The second question, which follows from that, is whether they see this as a final answer from Hamas, a take it or leave it, or whether they think there is room to negotiate and have some back and forth. And for Netanyahu, of course, the overarching concern will be, will my cabinet vote for this? The Israeli cabinet will have to approve this deal. And so he's going to be worried about whether he can convince his right-wing coalition partners to vote for it and without causing them to bolt the coalition and bring down the government.
Yeah. When you hear things like Hamas has moved to phase 2, this idea of talking about a permanent ceasefire, as opposed to keeping it at phase 3, I don't know. Do you hear stuff like that and just think, these folks are trying to get to know? Like they're agreeing to things and saying they agree on the same things, but then they don't. It's pretty stunning to me.
And they're trying to find, creative ways to fudge what is a very simple question. I mean, will this or will this not bring about an end to the war? And one party says yes, it should, and the other party says no, it shouldn't. And it's very hard to see a way to bridge those positions and find the middle ground. And so all of these very creative solutions of, well, we'll talk about ending the war, but not until phase 3, which will happen 84 days in the future. I think for the Biden administration, for the Arab states that are negotiating this, I think they recognize that a lot of that is you can put off that talk for months, but when it comes time to have that talk, the Israelis are just going to say no to it.
After the break, as the politicians go back and forth, the people of Gaza are holding their breath.
If you want to understand what is happening in the United States right now, you really need to understand what's happening with the courts, the law, and the Supreme Court. The battle between democracy and whatever this cage match is that we're witnessing, it's going to be won and lost at the ballot box, but it's also going to be won and lost in the courtrooms. I'm Dahlia Lithwick. I host Slate's legal podcast Amicus, and we are doubling our output, bringing you weekly episodes from here on in, because how else can we keep an eye on the many trials of Donald Trump, the conservative legal movement's assaults on our rights, the Supreme Court's latest slate of environmental gutting, gun safety eviscerating cases on the docket. So follow Amicus wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes dropping every Saturday morning.
Hours after Hamas declared it had accepted a ceasefire deal, the Israel Defense Forces said they had begun targeted strikes in Rafah. More than 1.5 million Gazans have fled to this southern city. And the question of whether Israel will launch a major offensive there is hanging over everyone's heads. Gregg says in general, Gaza is facing dire conditions, and that probably won't change anytime soon.
It's grim, it's miserable, and it has been for months. You have first the northern part of Gaza, where there are perhaps about 300,000 people still living in the north. No one knows for sure. There's not an accurate count, but it's a few 100,000 most likely. And there we've heard the head of the World Food Program, Cindy McCain, and various other officials have described the situation there as famine, as full-blown famine.
Like not the brink of famine.
Not the brink, right? We had months of talking about looming famine, and what various people have said in recent weeks is that it's an actual famine. Now, there's a technical definition of famine, which a UN body oversees, and it's based on several factors: malnutrition, children whose growth is stunted from not getting enough food, people dying from lack of food. And we don't know if northern Gaza, has met that technical definition yet, because there's a lot of research that has to go into that assessment. But the people who work, the World Food Program, the agency, the UN agency that is in charge of food aid, says there is a famine in the north of Gaza because there is simply not enough aid getting into that area. And there hasn't been for months now in the north.
I know that more aid has been coming in to Gaza, especially after an Israeli airstrike killed several World Central Kitchen workers. Is that helping?
Not as much as you would think. You're right. If you look at the numbers of trucks that are getting into Gaza each day, carrying food and medicine and other essentials, there was a big uptick immediately after those World Central Kitchen workers were killed by an Israeli strike. So where in the days before, you usually had less than 200 trucks a day crossing into Gaza, and compare that with 500 trucks a day that were going in before the war. Before the World Central Kitchen workers were killed, less than 200 a day. Immediately after that, the numbers started shooting up into the 300s, then into the 400s. And so in terms of volume, Gaza was getting pretty close to where it was before the war. But then you ran into a couple of issues with distribution. It's one thing to get the aid across the border into southern Gaza, but you then need to get it where it's needed. You need trucks and drivers to move it around. You need fuel for those trucks. You need warehouses to keep aid. And all of those things are in short supply at this point because so much of the infrastructure in Gaza has been damaged or destroyed over the past 7 months.
And most of the trucks are entering in the south, and the famine is happening in the north. So the trucks have to go a long way.
Exactly. And that's the root of the problem in northern Gaza. They have to go a long way. And not only that, they have to get past this line of Israeli troops bisecting Gaza, and trucks trying to go through there. They are routinely delayed. They're held up, for hours, often trying to get across that Israeli position and get into the north. And so there had been some efforts over the past few weeks to open a crossing in the northern part of Gaza, the Erez crossing. There had been an effort to open that crossing and then start delivering aid through the port of Ashdod, driving it 40 minutes down the road to Gaza, and then bringing it directly into the north. But we haven't seen big volumes of aid getting in that way. And we've seen cases in the past few weeks of right-wing Israelis stopping aid trucks on the way to that crossing. In one case, taking the sacks of flour, what looked like flour that were on the back of a truck, and cutting them open and spilling the contents out on the road. So it's been very difficult, even though that crossing is ostensibly open, it's been very difficult to scale that up and get any volume of aid into the north that way.
I'm curious if you can help me make sense of something else. On Sunday, Hamas launched an attack near a border crossing in Gaza. Can you explain what happened at this border crossing?
Kerem Shalom, the crossing in question here, it's always been the main commercial crossing for goods going into Gaza. It's set up, unlike many of the other crossings into Gaza, it's set up to be able to handle big volumes of trucks going in. And For some reason, Hamas decided to fire rockets at this crossing and killed and injured a number of people there, including Israeli soldiers who were there. I mean, it's hard to explain. Honestly, it's very hard to explain the rationale behind that.
Yeah, because when your people need aid, you need every border crossing open. It's how you feed your people. So the idea of attacking that particular location seems especially self-defeating to me, I guess.
I mean, I'm not sure I would say Hamas cares that much about feeding its people. I mean, and they've come out and said this actually in interviews since October 7th. You've had various Hamas officials who've said, our job is to be a military organization, and the job of the international community is to take care of civilians in Gaza and feed civilians in Gaza. And they've criticized the UN for not doing enough to take care of civilians and tried to absolve themselves of any responsibility. I mean, you could cynically say that the worse the humanitarian situation is in Gaza, the more pressure there is on Israel, the more international pressure there is on Israel. And so, in some way, if you're Hamas, it actually is beneficial to have a crisis in Gaza because it means more pressure on the Israeli government. But whether that was what was intended or not, I really can't say.
There was also a terrible heat wave in Gaza 2 weeks ago, like temperatures above 100 degrees. At least 2 people died. I hadn't even thought about that part of what is happening right now. How's that impacting life on the ground?
That is going to be life on the ground for at least the next few months as we head into summer. I mean, those temperatures, as you say, it was a heat wave for April. Those temperatures are very unusual for April, but they are pretty common in late June, July, August. Gaza is a hot and humid place, like most of Israel and the Palestinian territories. So you think about people living, first of all, not even living in tents, many of them are living in makeshift shelters that they have cobbled together with whatever material they could find. Maybe they found some sheets of plastic and they put those over some plywood. Maybe they cut open sacks of flour once they were empty and used that material to make a shelter. So these are not shelters that do anything to keep out the elements. Quite the opposite. They trap the heat in the summer. And so you talk to people about that heat wave and it's like being inside of a greenhouse. So it makes conditions miserable day and night. Obviously, there's no air conditioning or fans or anything like that because people don't have them and there's not electricity to run them, even if they did. Then there's also the question of water. Much of Gaza's water infrastructure has been damaged during the war. It was in terrible shape even before the war because of the long blockade. But it's been damaged. People are relying on a limited number of desalination plants to get water. They're often getting only a liter and a half of water per day. If you think about if it's 100 degrees outside, you need a lot of water to stay hydrated. People don't have it. So it's hot, people are dehydrated, people are hungry. And also, there's no sewage infrastructure right now. Sewage is going into open pits. There's no trash collection right now. Trash is piling up everywhere. You think about what happens to that in 100+ degree weather. There's a real concern about diseases and pests beginning to spread.
And as all this is happening, I feel like people are just discovering exactly what took place during the initial phase of this war. Like 2 mass graves were discovered at hospitals in Gaza, where the Israeli military had previously conducted raids. What do we know about these mass graves and what they imply about how this war has been fought?
We don't know much. The mass graves, as you say, they found 2 of them at hospitals. Now, there's 2 ways that you can think about those reports, or there's 2 different stories that people have put forward. One of them is that in the early weeks and months of the war, there were reports from Palestinian journalists in some cases that hospitals were burying people on the premises because it was impossible to get anyone to a cemetery because there was so much fighting going on in Gaza. And so there were reports of people who were either brought to the hospital who were already dead, who were killed by Israeli strikes, or people who died in the hospital being buried in graves at the hospital. So one explanation, possibly, is that these mass graves were Palestinians who died early in the war and were buried there by Palestinian medics and Palestinian hospital workers.
But there were reports that some people were bound, right?
Right, exactly. And that's, we don't know for sure whether or not those reports are true, but we have heard repeatedly now that has been the case, that bodies were found bound, bodies were found with bullet holes, with signs that they had been shot. Obviously, if people were tied up, if people were handcuffed, they were not patients who were buried by medics, and that would suggest that perhaps they were killed, that they were held prisoner by Israeli troops when they were operating in these hospitals, that they were killed, that they died, and that they were buried in these graves by Israeli troops. Exactly what happened, we don't know yet, but it's another, there are so many things that have happened over the past 7 months that need a proper investigation, so many things that do seem like they could plausibly have been war crimes committed by the Israeli army and ought to be properly investigated, but it's not clear when or if that is going to happen.
I gotta say, you have just described a horror show of a situation in Gaza. It's really hard for me to understand how much of what's happening there is intentional pain inflicted by the Israeli military versus like the unavoidable devastation of war.
I don't think much of it is the unavoidable devastation of war. I mean, it's true that urban warfare anywhere is a grim, bloody business, that it has horrific consequences for, in terms of civilian casualties, in terms of damage to infrastructure. It's difficult to fight in urban environments, and it's especially difficult when you're fighting a guerrilla force that doesn't wear uniforms and tries to blend into the population. So some of this, yes, it is unavoidable. But, I think there is ample evidence or ample reporting, at least by now, that the way the Israeli army and the Israeli government have approached this war, they have done so with a much greater tolerance for civilian casualties than many other militaries would. If you think about incidents like months ago, earlier on in the war, they were targeting this one particular commander and perhaps a handful of other low-level militants who were with him. And to target him, they basically took down an entire city block. They dropped a bomb that caused tunnels underground to collapse, which brought down a number of buildings. And the casualties from that, I don't think anyone knows the exact death toll, but certainly in the dozens, perhaps even in the hundreds. That ratio of dozens of civilian dead for one not particularly top-ranking military target is a ratio that when you talk to people from the Pentagon, people from European militaries, people from many Western armies, they tell you that is not a ratio that they would feel comfortable with.
Given the back and forth here over this ceasefire deal, the roller coaster nature of it, do you feel like the region is closer or farther away from some kind of permanent peace?
I think it's very far away from a permanent peace. I mean, even if there is tomorrow a quote-unquote permanent ceasefire that ends this war in Gaza, it doesn't resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? It doesn't resolve this occupation that has been ongoing since 1967. It doesn't resolve the issue that the Palestinians are still stateless. It doesn't solve the underlying conflict. And whether the next war is between Hamas and Israel or between some other group and Israel, there is inevitably going to be another round of conflict unless you actually do something to end the occupation and the underlying issue.
Gregg, I'm so grateful for your time and for your reporting here. It's really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Gregg Carlstrom is the Middle East correspondent for The Economist. And that's the show. If you're a fan of what we're doing here at What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to find out how. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. And I'm Mary Harris. You can go track me down on X if you want to. I'm at Mary's Desk. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time.
Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Ever combine an ice-cold frozen Coke with piping hot fries? Try frozen drinks any size for $1.49. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.